June 8, 1944, Normandy, France. The briefing room was cramped, carved into the stone cellar of a French chateau that had been requisitioned by the Wehrmacht. Maps covered the walls, marked with red lines and symbols that tracked Allied movements since D-Day, 2 days earlier. The air smelled of cigarette smoke and sweat and something else, something that might have been fear, though none of the officers gathered there would ever admit it. General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein stood at the front, his uniform immaculate despite the chaos outside. He commanded the Panzer Lehr Division, one of the most elite armored units in the German military. His men were veterans. His tanks were the best Germany could produce, panthers and tigers that had torn through Soviet armor on the Eastern Front like wolves through sheep. And now, as he looked at the intelligence reports spread across the table, Bayerlein did something that, in retrospect, would haunt him for the rest of his life. He laughed. "This is what we're supposed to be afraid of?" he said, holding up a photograph of an American M4 Sherman tank. "This toy?" The other officers in the room smiled. A few chuckled, because the photograph did make the Sherman look absurd. It was boxy, utilitarian, almost comically simple compared to the elegant, predatory lines of German armor. It looked like something a child might draw, a tank designed by accountants, not warriors. "The armor is thin," Bayerlein continued, reading from the intelligence report. "The gun is underpowered, the fuel consumption is inefficient, and the Americans are sending thousands of these things. They might as well be sending coffins on tracks." But one officer, a major named Klaus Hoffmann, a veteran of Kursk who had personally knocked out 17 Soviet T-34s, spoke up. "Sir, the reports say they're fast, and they're being produced in enormous numbers." Bayerlein waved a dismissive hand. "Speed doesn't matter when you can't penetrate armor. Numbers don't matter when each one is worth a tenth of a Panther. This is typical American thinking, quantity over quality. They don't understand war. They understand manufacturing." He tossed the photograph onto the table. "Let them come with their toys. We'll destroy them like we destroyed the Soviets, like we destroyed the British at Villers-Bocage. American industry means nothing against German engineering and German courage." The room erupted in agreement. Officers nodded, muttered assurances, voiced their confidence in German superiority. Because they believed it. Not out of propaganda, not out of blind faith, but because the evidence supported it. German tanks were objectively superior. German crews were better trained. German tactics had been refined through years of combat. How could they lose to a nation that had barely been in the war for 2 years? If stories like this matter to you, listen closely, because this is not a story about tanks. It's about the moment when everything you know, every assumption, every calculation, every certainty built on experience and evidence, is revealed to be incomplete. When you're so focused on the details that you miss the bigger picture. When you're so confident in your superiority that you don't see the revolution happening right in front of you. This is the story of German generals who laughed at American armor, who dismissed it as inferior, who mocked it as a waste of resources, and who, within weeks, watched in horror as those toys did something German tanks could never do. They showed up everywhere, all at once, in numbers so overwhelming that quality became irrelevant. History doesn't repeat itself, but it echoes, and if you listen closely enough, you can still hear the sound of laughter in that briefing room in Normandy. And then, weeks later, the silence that followed when those same officers realized they hadn't been fighting tanks. They had been fighting the future, and the future doesn't care how good your armor is. 3 days later, June 11th, 1944, outside the village of Villers-Bocage, Bayerlein stood in the commander's hatch of his Panther tank, binoculars pressed to his eyes, watching the road that led from the coast. His division had been deployed to stop the Allied advance, to hold the line, to buy time for reinforcements to arrive from the east. The morning was gray and drizzling, the kind of weather that turned fields into mud and made visibility miserable. Through the rain and mist, Bayerlein saw them. Sherman tanks, dozens of them, maybe more. They moved in column formation, their tracks churning up the wet road, their boxy silhouettes unmistakable even at a distance. Byerlin smiled. There they are, the American toys. He gave the order. His Panthers opened fire. The first Sherman exploded, its thin armor no match for the Panther's 75mm gun. Then the second, then the third. Within minutes, 6 Shermans were burning wrecks on the road, black smoke rising into the gray sky. Byerlin lowered his binoculars, satisfied. See, this is what happens when amateurs face professionals. But then something happened that Byerlin didn't expect. The American column didn't retreat. It didn't panic. It didn't break formation and scatter like the Soviets often did when faced with superior German armor. Instead, the Shermans spread out. They moved off the road into the fields, flanking positions. They didn't try to fight the Panthers head-on. They moved around them, fast, coordinated, and then, from 3 different directions at once, they opened fire. Not at the Panther's frontal armor, which was too thick for the Sherman's 75mm gun to penetrate, but at the sides, the rear, the weak points. And when a Sherman's gun couldn't penetrate, 2 more Shermans would fire at the same spot, then 3, then 4, overwhelming a single target with volume of fire until something gave way. A track, a fuel line, an ammunition store. Byerlin watched in disbelief as one of his Panthers, a machine that had survived Kursk, that had destroyed dozens of Soviet tanks, erupted in flames from a hit to its side armor. Then another, then another. "Fall back!" Byerlin shouted into the radio. "Fall back to the tree line!" His Panthers retreated, moving behind cover. But the Shermans kept coming, not recklessly, not suicidally, but methodically, professionally. Like water finding every crack in a dam, and that's when Byerlin realized something that made his blood run cold. The Shermans weren't better tanks. They were better at being tanks. They were faster, more reliable, easier to repair. Their crews could bail out quickly if hit. They could be replaced quickly if destroyed. They weren't built to win duels. They were built to win wars. By the end of the day, Byerlin had lost 12 Panthers. The Americans had lost 43 Shermans. But by the next morning, 30 of those Shermans had been recovered, repaired, and returned to service. All 12 Panthers were total losses, because German doctrine focused on quality and preservation. American doctrine focused on quantity and replacement. And in a war of attrition, quantity wins. That night, Byerlin sat in his command post, staring at a map. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from recognition, because he had seen this before. He had seen it on the Eastern Front, where Soviet T-34s, inferior to German armor in every technical specification, had overwhelmed German positions through sheer numbers and relentless aggression. But the Soviets had been desperate. The Soviets had been sacrificing men and machines because they had no other choice. The Americans weren't desperate. The Americans were strategic. They had built an entire military philosophy around a simple truth, that wars aren't won by having the best weapon. They're won by having enough weapons, and the ability to keep them in the fight. They expected superiority. They expected that German engineering, the precision, the power, the legendary quality that had made German tanks the terror of every battlefield, would be enough. That one Panther could defeat 5 Shermans. That one Tiger could defeat 10. And they were right. In a duel, a German tank would win almost every time. The armor was thicker. The gun was more powerful. The optics were better. The crews were more experienced. By every measurable metric, German tanks were superior. But war isn't a duel. War is logistics. And logistics is where the Americans had been planning for decades. The Sherman tank was designed with one philosophy in mind. It had to work. Not perfectly, not elegantly, just reliably. It had to be simple enough that a crew with minimal training could operate it. It had to be light enough to be transported across the Atlantic without straining shipping capacity. It had to be easy enough to repair that field mechanics could fix it with basic tools. It had to use components that could be mass-produced in factories across America. The Panther, by contrast, was a masterpiece of engineering. Complex, powerful, precise, and because of that complexity, it was a nightmare to maintain. The transmission broke constantly. The engine overheated. The tracks wore out quickly. Spare parts were scarce because each tank was essentially custom-built, and training a crew to operate it effectively took months. Germany produced approximately 6,000 Panthers during the entire war. America produced over 50,000 Shermans, and that ratio, that overwhelming numerical advantage, meant that even if German tanks won every engagement, they would eventually lose the war, because you can't replace what you can't build, and Germany couldn't build tanks fast enough. Bayerlein understood this now. He had been so focused on the technical specifications, the armor thickness, the gun penetration, the engine horsepower, that he had missed the strategic reality. The Sherman wasn't designed to be better than the Panther. It was designed to be everywhere. And in war, being everywhere matters more than being invincible. But there was another factor, something even more damning, something that went beyond logistics and manufacturing. The Americans had an advantage that couldn't be measured in millimeters of armor or velocity of shells. They had air superiority. By June 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. German planes were outnumbered, outgunned, and grounded by lack of fuel. American planes, meanwhile, owned the skies, and that meant every time a German tank column moved, it was spotted, tracked, reported, and then destroyed by fighter bombers before it ever reached the front line. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a plane that German pilots had once mocked as the flying brick, became the nightmare of every German tanker. Not because it could penetrate a Panther's armor directly, but because it could drop bombs, fire rockets, and strafe exposed crew members until the tank was disabled or abandoned. One of Bayerlein's officers, Major Hoffman, the veteran of Kursk, put it bluntly after a week of fighting in Normandy. "Sir, we're not losing to American tanks. We're losing to American factories, and American planes, and American fuel, and American food. We're not fighting an army. We're fighting an economy, and you can't shoot an economy." Bayerlein wanted to argue, to insist that German courage and German skill would overcome American resources, but he couldn't. Because Hoffman was right. Germany was fighting a war it couldn't win, not because its soldiers weren't brave, not because its weapons weren't effective, but because it was fighting an enemy that could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. The paradox was brutal. German tanks were better, but that didn't matter, because better doesn't win wars. Enough wins wars, and America had enough. By late June, Bayerlein's Panzer Lehr Division had been reduced to half strength, tanks destroyed, crews killed or wounded, supplies running low, and worst of all, morale crumbling. Because his men, veterans who had fought across Europe, who had believed in German superiority, who had never questioned that victory was inevitable, were starting to doubt. One evening, Bayerlein gathered his surviving officers in a makeshift command post, a farmhouse that had been abandoned when the fighting started. The room was lit by candles. The electricity had been cut days ago. Outside, the sound of artillery rumbled like distant thunder. "We need to discuss our situation," Bayerlein said, his voice flat and tired. Major Hoffman spoke first. "Sir, we can't continue like this. We're losing 3 tanks for every one we destroy. We're out of spare parts. Half our men are exhausted. If we stay here, we'll be annihilated." Another officer, Captain Ernst Weber, a younger man who still believed in the cause, shot back. "We were ordered to hold this position. If we retreat, we'll be court-martialed or shot." "If we stay, we'll be dead anyway," Hoffman said. Bayerlein raised a hand for silence. "The problem isn't the order. The problem is the reality. We're not fighting a normal enemy. We're fighting an enemy that can afford to lose, and we can't." He looked around the room. "How many Panthers do we have operational?" 18, sir." "And how many did we start with?" 84. The number hung in the air like a death sentence. In 3 weeks they had lost more than 3/4 of their armor, not to superior tactics, not to better soldiers, but to attrition, to the relentless, grinding reality that every tank they destroyed was replaced within days, while every tank they lost was gone forever. "What do the Americans have?" Bayerlein asked. "Intelligence estimates at least 200 Shermans in our sector, and more arriving every day." Bayerlein closed his eyes. 200 against 18. The math was simple, inevitable. "We're going to lose," he said quietly. The room fell silent, because no one had said it out loud before. They had all thought it. They had all known it, but hearing it spoken by their commander, a man who had fought across North Africa, who had survived Stalingrad, who had believed in victory even when victory seemed impossible, made it real. Weber, the young captain, stood up abruptly. "Sir, with respect, we can't talk like this. The men—" "The men know," Bayerlein interrupted. "They're not blind. They see the planes. They see the supply shortages. They see the replacements that never arrive. They know we're losing, and pretending otherwise doesn't help them. It just makes them feel like we're lying to them." He looked at Weber. "Courage doesn't mean believing in lies. It means facing the truth and fighting anyway. And the truth is, we're fighting a war we can't win. But we're still soldiers. We still have orders. So we'll do what soldiers do. We'll fight until we can't anymore." Hoffman spoke up. "And then what?" Bayerlein didn't answer, because he didn't have an answer, or rather, he did, but it was one he wasn't ready to say out loud. Surrender. Eventually, they would surrender, because that's how losing wars end. Not with glory, not with honor, just with exhaustion. But for now, they would fight, because that's all they knew how to do. The Battle of Normandy became a crucible that revealed a fundamental truth about modern warfare: that technological superiority means nothing without industrial capacity to sustain it. Germany's tank development had followed a philosophy of continuous improvement. The Panzer III had been good. The Panzer IV had been better. The Panther had been exceptional. The Tiger had been legendary. Each generation of tank was more powerful, more sophisticated, more deadly than the last. But each generation was also more complex, more difficult to produce, more expensive, more specialized. Germany was building tanks the way it built everything, with precision, with craftsmanship, with an obsessive attention to detail. America, by contrast, was building tanks the way it built cars, on assembly lines, with interchangeable parts, with a focus on reliability over perfection. The Sherman wasn't the best tank in the war. It was the most practical tank, and in a war that consumed machines faster than they could be replaced, practical mattered more than perfect. By the end of 1944, the disparity was staggering. Germany produced approximately 19,000 tanks of all types during the entire war. America produced over 88,000. The Soviet Union produced over 105,000. The Axis powers were drowning in Allied armor, not because Allied tanks were better, but because there were so many of them that it didn't matter. Bayerlein saw this reality play out in brutal detail. By August 1944, his division had been effectively destroyed. The survivors were pulled back to Germany to refit, but there were no tanks to refit with. The factories were being bombed around the clock. The supply lines were shattered. The resources were gone. In September, Bayerlein was summoned to a meeting in Berlin with other senior officers. The purpose was to discuss the state of German armor and develop strategies for the coming year. But the meeting quickly devolved into something else: a reckoning. One general, a man named Heinz Guderian, the father of German armored doctrine, stood up and said what everyone was thinking. "We lost this war in 1942. We just didn't know it yet. We lost it the moment we failed to knock out the Soviet Union before America entered the fight. Because once America entered, once their factories started running, we were fighting an enemy we couldn't outlast." Another general protested. "But our tanks are superior." "Our tanks are irrelevant," Guderian shouted. "Do you understand? It doesn't matter that the Tiger can destroy 10 Shermans if America can build 100 Shermans for every Tiger we produce. It doesn't matter that our crews are better trained if they're dead because we can't provide air cover. It doesn't matter that our engineering is superior if we can't get fuel to the front lines. He slammed his hand on the table. We've been fighting this war like it's 1940, like quality and tactics and courage are enough. But this isn't 1940. This is total war. And in total war, the side with more factories wins. The side with more oil wins. The side that can replace losses faster than the enemy can inflict them wins. And that side is not us. The room was silent. Because Guderian was right. And they all knew it. Bierlein thought about the Sherman tanks he had mocked, the toys he had dismissed, and he realized that he had been looking at them wrong. The Sherman wasn't a tank, it was a symbol of an economy so vast, so productive, so unimaginably powerful that it could afford to build machines that were merely good enough and still win. Because when you can build 50,000 of something, good enough becomes overwhelming. Germany had been trying to win with masterpieces. America had won with mass production. And in the end, the mass production had buried the masterpieces under sheer weight. They called it the Panther, the perfect synthesis of firepower, armor, and mobility, the tank that would turn the tide, the answer to Soviet T-34s and American Shermans and British Churchills, and it was beautiful, sleek, deadly, a machine that looked like it had been designed by artists as much as engineers. When it worked, it was unstoppable. But that was the problem, when it worked. Because the Panther's transmission was so complex that it had a tendency to break after 150 kilometers of driving. The engine overheated in hot weather and froze in cold weather. The interleaved road wheels, which provided excellent ride quality, clogged with mud and froze solid in winter, immobilizing the tank. Spare parts were so scarce that tanks were often cannibalized to keep others running. The Sherman, by contrast, was ugly, utilitarian, uninspiring, but it ran, always. The engine was a simple, reliable design borrowed from commercial trucks. The transmission was so robust that it could be abused by inexperienced drivers and still function. The tracks were easy to replace. The mechanical components were standardized across the entire production run, meaning that parts from one Sherman could be used on any other Sherman. One American tank crew, when asked about the Sherman, said, "It's not the best tank, but it's the only tank that you can drive across France, get shot up, repair in a field with basic tools, and drive back into combat the next day. And that's what matters." Bierlein experienced this irony firsthand. In October 1944, he was reassigned to command a battle group in the Ardennes, preparing for what would become the Battle of the Bulge. His unit was supposed to have 40 Panthers. He received 12. Half of them broke down before reaching the front line. The ones that did make it fought valiantly, destroying dozens of Allied tanks. But by the end of the offensive, all 12 were either destroyed or abandoned due to lack of fuel. Meanwhile, American tank crews were painting kill marks on their Shermans, taking them back to repair depots when damaged, and returning to combat in the same tank, sometimes multiple times. The Sherman had become more than a machine. It was a reliable partner, a survivor, a tank that brought crews home. The irony was almost unbearable. Germany had built the better tank and lost the war. America had built the practical tank and won. Because war rewards the side that can keep fighting, not the side that can fight better. Bierlein met an American tank commander after the war, during the Nuremberg trials, when both men were called as witnesses. The American, a captain named John Murphy, had commanded a Sherman throughout the campaign in Europe. He recognized Bierlein's name and approached him during a break. "You commanded Panzer Lehr?" Murphy asked. "Yes." "We fought you outside Villers-Bocage, June 1944. Bierlein nodded. "I remember. You lost 40 tanks that day." "And came back with 30 of them," Murphy said. "How many did you get back?" Bierlein was silent. Murphy continued, not unkindly, "You had the better tanks. Everyone knew it. We knew it every time we faced you, but you know what we said in our briefings? Doesn't matter how good their tanks are if they can't field them. And eventually you couldn't. You ran out of tanks, you ran out of fuel, you ran out of time. We didn't. That's the difference. He paused. You were better soldiers, better engineers, better tacticians, but we were better at logistics, and logistics wins wars. Fritz Bayerlein survived the war. He was captured in April 1945, held as a prisoner for 2 years, and then released. He returned to Germany and tried to rebuild his life. But the war haunted him. Not the battles, not the defeats, but the moment when he had laughed at a photograph of a Sherman tank and called it a toy. Because that moment represented everything that had gone wrong. The arrogance, the certainty, the belief that quality would triumph over quantity, the inability to see the bigger picture. In 1955, Bayerlein was interviewed by a German military historian who was writing a book about the Panzer divisions. The historian asked him what he had learned from the war. Bayerlein thought for a long time. Then he said, "I learned that wars are not won by having the best soldiers or the best weapons. They're won by having enough soldiers and enough weapons. We spent the war building masterpieces. The Americans spent the war building machines. And when the masterpieces broke, we had nothing to replace them. But when the machines broke, the Americans fixed them and sent them back. Or they built new ones. Or they sent 10 more to replace the one that was lost." He paused. "We thought we were fighting a military. We were fighting an economy. And you can't defeat an economy with tanks, no matter how good those tanks are." The historian asked, "Do you regret anything?" Bayerlein laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "I regret laughing at the Sherman. I regret dismissing it as inferior, because it wasn't inferior. It was different. It was designed for a different kind of war, a war we didn't understand until it was too late." Fritz Bayerlein died in 1970, at the age of 71. He was buried in a small cemetery in Bavaria. No military honors, no speeches, just a quiet funeral attended by family and a few former comrades. On his desk, when he died, was a photograph, not of a panther or a tiger, but of an M4 Sherman tank. On the back, in his handwriting, were the words, "The tank that won the war." He left Normandy believing in superiority, and died understanding that superiority means nothing without sustainability. There is a lesson here, a lesson about the danger of focusing on perfection at the expense of practicality. Germany's obsession with engineering excellence, with building the best tank, the best plane, the best weapon, was both its greatest strength and its fatal weakness. Because excellence takes time, it takes resources, it takes expertise. And in a war of attrition, time is the one thing you don't have. The Sherman tank was a compromise. It wasn't the most powerful. It wasn't the most heavily armored. It wasn't the most sophisticated. But it was good enough. And more importantly, it was producible. It was fixable. It was sustainable. This philosophy, good enough, mass-produced, sustainable, is what won World War II, not just in tanks, but in everything. American factories produced more planes, more trucks, more guns, more ships, more of everything than the Axis powers could match. Not because American engineering was better, but because American industry was structured around a simple truth, that you don't need to make the best product. You need to make enough of a good product. Germany never learned this lesson. Even as the war turned against them, even as their factories were bombed and their supply lines shattered, they continued pursuing perfection. They developed the Tiger II, an even heavier, more powerful tank than the Tiger War. They developed jet fighters. They developed rockets, each more sophisticated than the last. But sophistication doesn't matter when you can't produce enough of it, when your factories are rubble, when your supply lines are cut, when your enemies are flooding the battlefield with machines that work. History doesn't repeat itself. It waits for those who forget to listen. And right now, in a world where technology is advancing faster than ever, where companies and countries are racing to build the most sophisticated products, the most advanced weapons, the most perfect systems. The lesson of the Sherman matters more than ever, because perfection is expensive. Perfection takes time. Perfection is fragile. And in a crisis, whether it's a war or a pandemic or an economic collapse, perfection fails. What survives is what's practical, what's sustainable, what's good enough to work when everything else breaks down. The Sherman was good enough, and good enough won the war. Bayerlein understood this. Too late, but he understood it. And the tragedy of his story is that millions of people had to die before the lesson was learned, before Germany realized that you can't win a war with quality alone, that you need quantity, that you need logistics, that you need an economy that can sustain the fight. There are more stories like this one, stories about the moment when arrogance met reality, when assumptions shattered against facts, when the side that should have won didn't, because they were fighting the wrong war. If this matters to you, if you believe we need to understand not just who won, but why they won, subscribe to Warden of War. The archive opens every week, and every story reveals something we thought we knew about strategy, about power, about what actually wins wars. Which story should we open next? Tell us in the comments, and let us know where you're watching from. Are there engineers and military historians out there who can add to this discussion? What are your thoughts on the quality versus quantity debate? Share this with someone who's obsessed with having the best of everything. Because sometimes good enough is better than perfect. Sometimes sustainability matters more than superiority. And sometimes the side that wins isn't the one with the best weapon. It's the one that can keep their weapons in the fight.